Hello and welcome back, adventurers. This is Captain TTRPG, and today we're talking about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Welcome back, adventurers. Today, once again, we're going to have a little chat. This time, it's all about the remastering. And yes, this one is just as ill-advised as the last, so apparently I'm a masochist. So please, ready your pitchforks and let's dive in. The year is 2023, January 2023 to be specific, and everybody was going about their TTRPG lives without care, when WotC decides to become just a little more scummy. And thus the OGL 1.1 scandal was born. Actually, WotC decisions for this were all made in 2022, and letters went out to creators in late 2022, but the general public, we found out in 2023. All of those companies, which referenced the OGL, many, in their books, collectively realized just how unsafe they were. As players and GMs flocked to more ethical pastures, Paizo found themselves selling out quite a few printings of their books. Yes, the original PF2e core rulebooks did in fact invoke the OGL from WotC. To keep themselves safe from potential greed, the folks at Paizo decided to remove the OGL from their books and any references to D&D, which still remained in the core rulebooks, with some of the monsters and features really in name only, because none of these were truly like their D&D incarnations. Given the undertaking ahead of themselves, I would like to think that they realized that it was a chance to rectify some wrongs in their own works as well. If you have to make changes throughout your rule books, why not also correct any perceived mistakes in the content as well? And thus, the Remaster project was born. And yes, this is entirely dramatic license, and I have no idea what they talked about at Paizo. Either way, the result was the same. We, the PF2e community, would go on to receive 2 remastered Player Core books, Player Core 1 and Player Core 2, each with 8 remastered classes, as well as ancestries and other things, a remastered GM core, and a remastered monster core. And we are starting to receive remasters of books like Guns and Gears, which would be follow-ons from those core rulebooks the first time around. The question I look to answer today, well, the questions are, did the remasters succeed at their purpose? And what should we hope to see as we continue to get more remastered books like Guns and Gears going forward? The first question is really the most important in my mind. When we look back at the changes to the Player Core books, there are some massive overhauls, and I believe for the better. The Witch is probably the best example. This class really didn't keep up with other classes well in its original version. It was often considered one of the weakest classes, though of course not by everybody, and it struggled in play. Enter the Remaster, where the interaction between the Witch and the Witch's Familiar is massively improved. The subclass abilities that are passive, that trigger when you use a curse, suddenly these are this new addition to the class that feels thematic, and it gives you a different tie to your Familiar with deeper mechanics. And finally, the Witch has become the strongest Familiar class in the game. It used to be where you could be a wizard with the right feat choices and have a Familiar as good or even slightly better than the Witch had, and that felt silly. The curses were also updated and fit the play and the feats of the Witch in a meaningful way, but the Witch wasn't the only success story. Champions received a massive overhaul to their class, changing around features within the class and adding in new feats, removing feats that weren't very useful. Clerics received a bevy of new feats and ways to take advantage of your playstyle that you preferred when you really just got 2 with the subclasses. Rules were removed, which really hampered the choices. It made it harder to play the class, so they really streamlined the build. And the free uses that clerics get of Heal, their divine font, that was also massively changed. So no longer did it rely on your charisma, now you just get 4 uses at level 1, and it increases over time. Fantastic. Big change. Let's look at the Alchemist. The Alchemist is barely recognizable as a class. It got so many changes in its core features, everything with advanced alchemy and versatile vials, and how that plays into your subclasses and just the benefits you get from your subclasses. it's like a whole new class, and it functions so much better. The Alchemist actually measures up against other classes now. And then other classes besides those got quality of life changes, if nothing else. Well, at least several of them. So we see things like the Barbarian now getting to rage as a free action at initiative. We got rogues and bards with martial weapons. It became easier for investigators to trigger their devise a stratagem, significantly easier, in fact. And of course, I already mentioned the cleric's divine font change. I love all of that. And in many cases, it was absolutely needed. But here's my issue. The classes I didn't list, well, they really didn't change all that much, and or didn't have their issue dealt with. Rangers have always been a decent class, not really blowing anybody away with their uniqueness, but a solid martial character nonetheless. They have a few serious issues, though, in my mind. The first of which is they have a start of combat tax with hunt prey. Granted, you could have been hunting prey, and that's maybe how you tracked it down, but that's not going to be the common case. You have a tax that barbarians no longer have to pay with rage, but you still have to. The second is they have just 3 subclasses, and each of those subclasses only gives you something at level 1 and level 17. I mean, at that point, is there really any reason to have subclasses? That's pretty sad. And third, their animal companion progression is slower than almost every other companion class in the game, including archetypes. Why are they so much worse at training their pets? Not one of these was dealt with in the remaster, even though none of those would have been particularly challenging, maybe the subclass one, to fix. Another class with an action tax as combat starts is the monk. Most, though, admittedly not all monks, enter a stance as their first action. And yes, this is a feat at level 12 that allows you to do this. But that's just it. Barbarians now can rage for a free action at start of combat from level 1. If you want to do this as a monk, change stance I mean, you have to enter your stance with an action until you're level 12, and at level 12, you can spend a feat to be able to avoid that tax. That just feels bad. It's like they just wanted to ignore the monk. Monk is a solid martial class, but it could have benefited from a design change beyond just giving them that free option at the start of combat. I know not everyone would agree with me, but I believe that an opportunity existed to create a true subclass structure for the monk that would have allowed better development than just the feats allow. The same could be said for the fighter. It's meant to be a simple class to pick up and play, so they don't have subclasses. Fine, I get it. But it still feels like it's lacking some sort of mechanic. Some sort of mechanic that it could utilize that doesn't have to be complex, but still makes it a little more interesting to play the class. I don't mean the types of mechanics we see with the Runesmith and Necromancer in the Impossible Playtest, or even what we have with the Exemplar, but something on the complexity of rage or hunt prey. Just something to make them stand out in a different way other than just being the class that's most likely to crit. For almost every class in Player Core and Player Core 2 that didn't receive a complete overhaul, there's at least one thing that stands out as a clear deficiency they could have addressed. Bards could get a free composition cantrip cast on turn 1 so that they can still move and spend 2 actions to cast a regular spell, for instance. Druids could have all been given a focus spell to transform into animals, because let's be honest, that's what people feel druids should do. We already talked about rangers, fighters, and monks. Wizards could have used some way to tax themselves to boost a spellcasting beyond their normal limits, or something to show off their mastery of the arcane, something to make them stand out amongst spellcasters. And sorcerers, well, all right, so sorcerers I actually don't think they need a lot. They already had some interesting mechanics, and they're probably one of the few that they're fine. And they did get some updates. Let's be clear, they did get some updates. I just didn't get deep into them. So sorcerers are probably fine. All I'm trying to say is some of the classes got remastered, and I am thankful for that. But many, honestly, didn't get enough to consider themselves remastered. In that way, outside of the OGL necessity, I'm not sure that this really succeeded as a remaster of the Player Core books. And those books have the best claim to being remastered. When we look at the GM Core, I'm sure there are plenty of changes, but they're so insignificant that when I went to write this, I had to go look at the book again to try to remember anything that was different. That's how little it mattered, honestly. And then finally, we have Monster Core. I love what they did with the new dragons. Do not get me wrong. I saw leaks come out, and when it came out in the book, I was not disappointed. They are fantastic. They differentiate from each other greatly. Cool mechanics, very thematic, love it. Sadly, that same excitement didn't go beyond the dragons. I'm not saying that every creature in the book should have been rehauled in the way that the dragons were. I'm not saying every one of them needed brand new mechanics they didn't have. But let's be honest, a lot of the monsters in there just aren't different enough from what we had before, or just don't blow us away. So it's almost like, okay, you managed to avoid potential lawsuits in the future, and that's kind of where you stopped in that book. Overall, in my mind, the remasters have been a failure. There are shining corners, and they shine very, very brightly, but not enough to fill the room. Sadly, we live in the dim light of remaster mediocrity. That brings us to question number 2. What can we hope to see from future remasters? I phrased it this way because I have hope. Not a ton in mind, as Guns and Gears barely touched the classes, and boy, did they both have features, subclasses, mechanics, etc. worth improving that didn't get touched. But I believe that as we go forward, if we let them know how we feel, there is still a chance that we could see the Magus or Psychic again, as they might feel fresh, or the Thaumaturge and Summoner might flow better in combat, because the remastered classes that have seen a remaster, all of those which came out prior to Kineticist, have room to grow, shift, and improve. I'm going to quickly run down what I could consider like bare minimum changes for some of the remaining classes, and this is just to get ideas flowing, because I just want to put them out there. I'm sure everybody watching this video would have much more interesting ideas. For the Summoner, revisit the shared health pool, for one. Don't remove it, but perhaps ease the burden a bit, however you want to handle that, maybe some sort of temporary hit point situation. Oh, and look at the spell slots again. I get it. Limited spell casting because you've got a spellcaster and a marshal kind of put together, but honestly, it's a little too limited, and that's true for every limited spellcasting caster. For the Magus, please make failed spell strikes less punishing. It truly is a feel-bad class, with its feast or famine play. Also, it's just not fun trying to meet the requirements of multiple spell strikes in a combat. For the Psychic, perhaps weave some sort of mechanics together so there aren't as many to keep track of. I know multiple Psychics that forgot Unleash their Psyche at all because they're so focused on the amps, the enhanced cantrips, and just casting their spells. I don't want it gone. Just clean the mechanics up, so maybe something like you want to do more often or integral to the play. Maybe they trigger off of other things you do to make it all feel coherent. And finally, for the Thaumaturge, remove some of the restrictions the class has, like the one-handed melee for weapon implement. Also, let them recall knowledge as a free action on turn 1 in combat. This is kind of the barbarian rage thing. These are just top-of-mind ideas and should be addressed, but if you are going to remaster these books, make it worth the undertaking. I love this game. And the lack of strong remaster hasn't changed that. They were already good classes. It's already a good game. I enjoy the changes we did get, but again, if I don't point out what I think could improve in the game, I would be letting myself and the community down. Then again, maybe I'm way off base. Maybe you all love the remasters, and I should just sit in a corner and think about what I've said here today. Let me know in the comments. For now, I'm going to think of other class changes, and as always, adventure on.